All right, guys and girls, it's Jerningham here. I'm updating the news today of coronavirus numbers UK. The deaths in the UK today of coronavirus numbers are 70. Pardon me, 70 deaths. I've got the hiccups again today as well. And the confirmed cases of people catching corona in the UK are 14,162. I'm going to be showing you Nicola Sturgeon. She's a Scottish Prime Minister. She's going to be speaking in a minute. And there's the cases, so people think, oh, I'm not making it up. There you go, Valley of, here we go, 14,000, and there's 70 future cases of coronavirus. The coronavirus doesn't seem to be slowing down, it's getting worse. One day it's 19, next day it's 70. Unless they're just updating when they didn't update a couple of weeks ago with the lag in the system, and, you know, I don't know. But for the future deaths from 9 p.m. on Wednesday, US Department of Justice has announced a change, else Alexander, who will violate members of called over being civil, well, that's supposed to mean hostages or something, includes James Foley, Stephen Soley, and it's talking about Syria. I don't know what it's going on about. I'm trying to read it. Donald Trump it's talking about as well.
However,
this is Nicola
she did
Sturgeon.
talk about those 5 areas you just mentioned, Mark. The restrictions there are pretty strong and they're pretty strict, and that is a huge part of Scotland, probably more than half the population of Scotland. The most densely populated areas, the central belt, and in those areas people are being asked not to use public transport.
So these are the restrictions in Scotland of where it's
for the
happening.
Labour Party. The shadow Scottish Secretary Ian Murray has said it should never have come to this. Under the SNP, Scotland has the highest R rate in
Lancashire,
accusing the SNP of a complete failure to tackle the spread of the virus. He said,
I'm just showing you a bit of the news, guys and girls, so you know what it is.
Test and protect, ignored warnings about the return of students to university, and he is accusing the SNP of incompetence in the same way that Labour are accusing Boris Johnson of incompetence.
Yeah, and all sorts of controversy over exams this year. They've moved now, or John Swinney has, to cancel quite early, actually, the National
Scotland edition security John Swinson National 5X was cancelled 2021 due to COVID-19 restrictions. We're not even in 2021 yet.
On exams this year, and of course we had the exams fiasco in England, which and the action that Mr. Swinney has announced this afternoon will put pressure on Gavin Williamson here in London to do something similar. So what Mr. Swinney announced in another statement to the Scottish Parliament an hour after Nicola Sturgeon's, the National 5 exams, that's GCSE style exams, 15, 16-year-olds, they're going to be cancelled. Students based on work based on career work assessment
measures which restrictions sells alcohol outdoors from Friday for 16 days has told shops to return the 2 meters social distance rule in Scotland.
To give more time for teaching. Well, there's pressure on Mr. Williamson to do the same in England, but this
the virus pandemic departs health has been the future
up in Scotland.
The alternative approach to awarding National 5 qualifications will be based on 2 key recommendations by Professor Mark Priestley. These recommendations are, and I quote, the suspension of the National 5 examinations in 2021 with qualifications awarded on the basis of centre estimation based upon validated assessments. So the alternative approach will be based on teacher judgment, supported by assessment resources and quality assurance. This will include, where possible, specifying between 2 and 4 pieces of work per subject that will form the basis of arriving at a final award.
So while Nicola Sturgeon and Mr. Swinney have made their announcements in Scotland, here in Whitehall, the Health Secretary Matt Hancock's been meeting sharing what's called a Gold Command meeting this afternoon with officials and politicians in the regions to discuss the next steps in England. But we are told by senior Whitehall sources that any announcements on what's called a traffic light 3-tier system won't be now until next week. We need to do this right rather than rushing it. That's according to a government figure here in Whitehall, but in Scotland, they've already announced what they intend to do.
Yeah, okay, John, thank you. We'll get more on coronavirus in just a moment, but let's bring you details of another big breaking story this evening. And the United States has announced that it's bringing terrorism charges against two British men accused of being part of the Islamic State cell known as the Beatles. Alexander Caughtit and El Shafi El Sheikh, both from West London, allegedly belonged to that group of executioners known as the Beatles because of their British accents.
My message to other terrorists is this: if you harm an American, you will face the same fate as these men. You will face American arms in the battlefield. And if you survive that, you will face American justice in an American courtroom and the prospect of many years in an American prison. Either way, you will never live in peace. You will be pursued to the ends of the earth.
Well, our defence and security correspondent Alistair Bunkle has the latest.
This is a day that they have been wanting to come for some time now. These men were captured in Syria by Kurdish forces 2 years ago. They were transferred over to US custody in Iraq about 12 months ago. And it's been a little bit of a process to get them to the United States. And one of the sort of sticking points, Mark, for a bit, was around the British position on all of this. They were, of course, British nationals until their their nationalities, were removed from them. But of course, the British authorities, the British security services, know a lot about them. They've got a lot of information on them. They've got a lot of intelligence on them. And that kind of information will be very valuable in the upcoming court case if the Americans want to successfully prosecute them. But Britain wouldn't give that information over until they had assurances that Alexander Caughtit and El Shafi El Sheikh would not face the death penalty. And that assurance came a couple of months ago, which basically cleared the way for today's events to happen. So, yeah, back to your original question about the reaction from the families. Well, the James Foley Foundation has released a statement that reads this: James, Peter, Kayla, and Stephen were kidnapped, tortured, beaten, starved, and murdered by members of the Islamic State in Syria. Now our families can pursue accountability for these crimes against our children in a US court. We are hopeful that the US government will finally be able to send the important message that if you harm Americans, you will never escape justice. And when you are caught, you'll face the full power of American law. The brother of David Haines as well, a British man who was killed by them, Mike Haines, has said that Haines' family, along with all the families of the victims, are pleased to see this step forward in the judicial system. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has welcomed the transfer of these two men to the United States.
Alistair Bunkle there. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to Diane Foley, whose son James, as we heard there, was executed by the group in 2014.
It almost feels miraculous. At times, I despaired whether it would ever happen. And again, it is thanks to good people on all sides of the Atlantic, all parts of the world, really, recognizing that it's essential to have accountability when there's acts of terror or crime created. Otherwise, with impunity, it is rampant and it continues to terrorize us. So I think this is a huge step forward, and hopefully these men will implicate others and give us information about where the remains of our children are, and many, many innocents, the British victims as well as innocent people in Syria.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, are you any closer to finding out the details of where the remains are?
No, and I'm hoping that these men know. They know a lot that could shed light on that, and, as I said, implicate others. They were not the only two that inflicted the horror on hundreds of thousands of innocents in Syria. Our Americans, the British victims, but they are two who were allegedly very much a part of it. And so it is a huge step forward, and I am hugely grateful.
And you say in a statement I've just seen that, you think you can now pursue accountability Do you think you will get accountability?
I'm hopeful, yes. I do feel that now that our Department of Justice is working so closely with the UK, Scotland Yard, and others who are working to put all the evidence together, that at least we have a chance of a fair trial for Caughtit and Al-Sheikh and for justice in this regard. So I do think it's an opportunity. You know, it's interesting, Mark, that these two men have been held for the same number of months that our son was held by them, but with opposite circumstances. These men have access to food and shelter, legal representation, and safety, whereas our victims were tortured, starved, and finally murdered in the most gruesome way. So I'm hoping that we can show the world that justice will prevail.
That was Diane Foley speaking to me a short while ago. Let's just return to the virus now. And government insiders have told Sky News that ministers are preparing to introduce further restrictions in the north of England. It comes as the leaders of 4 northern councils have warned the government that existing coronavirus restrictions aren't working. Leading politicians from Leeds, Manchester, Newcastle and Liverpool, some of the UK's worst affected areas, have told the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, that some of the rules are confusing and counterproductive.
We're now talking about 55% of our cases being in the 17 to 21 age group, probably less than 2.5% in the more vulnerable over 60 age group. So actually having restrictions that hit the entirety of the population are not addressing the problems we currently face.
Well, the issue of the postcode lockdown dominated Prime Minister's questions this afternoon, particularly when it came to the 10 p.m. curfew for bars and restaurants.
Next week, this House will vote on whether to approve the 10 p.m. rule. The Prime Minister knows that there are deeply held views across the country in different ways on this. One question is now screaming out, is there a scientific basis for the 10 p.m. rule? The public deserve to know. Parliament deserves to know. If there is, why doesn't the government do itself a favour and publish it? If not, why doesn't the government review the rule? So will the Prime Minister commit? Will the Prime Minister commit to publishing the scientific basis for the 10 p.m. rule before this House votes on it next Monday?
Mr. Speaker, the basis on which we set out the curtailment of hospitality was the basis on which he accepted it 2 weeks ago. And that is to reduce the spread of the virus, Mr. Speaker. And that is our objective. That's why we introduced the rule of 6, Mr. Speaker, which again he supported only 2 weeks ago, and yet last night they have said, and today they're withdrawing their support for other restrictions. What kind of a signal, Mr. Speaker, does this send to the people of the country about the robustness of the Labour Party and their willingness to enforce the restrictions? Mr. Speaker, that's not new leadership, that's no leadership.
Well, some leading scientists have proposed a herd immunity approach to the coronavirus pandemic. The so-called Great Barrington Declaration calls for focused protection, which means shielding those most at risk while allowing people at minimal risk of the disease to carry on normally.
The outcome that we really all want is by allowing what we call herd immunity, in other words, levels of population immunity to build up, because that reduces the risk to everybody and allows us to resume a normal life. We feel that that could happen without the attendant deaths that it might otherwise entail if we focus our protection on those who are most likely to have those adverse outcomes of infection. So move away from thinking about rise in infection, spike in cases, and think about protecting those who are at risk of dying from infection.
To suggest we just return to normal and allow this virus to spread amongst those who are considered to be less vulnerable, I think is somewhat naive, because for one, we know that we don't necessarily readily develop immunity to this virus, or certainly not necessarily for a very prolonged period. So the concept of herd immunity in that setting is still unclear. So we wouldn't necessarily achieve herd immunity by doing that. But also, we would be putting people at risk who may well go on to have long-term problems from this virus.
Well, our science correspondent Thomas Moore assesses the likely impact if the Great Barrington Declaration was to be adopted.
What the signatories of the Great Barrington Declaration are saying is that the pain has been too great, that older people have 1,000 times higher risk of death from COVID-19 than younger people, and therefore the effort to protect them should be concentrated on them and not spread across wider society. They argue that, as you say, that herd immunity could be built up in younger people by allowing them to get on with their normal lives, while being really tough on shielding older people, more vulnerable people at home for a period of months, perhaps even up to Easter. The problem, though, and this has been attacked by many other scientists, is that you can't keep the virus out of care homes, because, as we know from the first wave, 14,000 people died in care homes. It's very difficult to keep the virus out. And there are also problems over the guarantee of herd immunity. 8% of people are immune so far. You would need between 50 and 60% to build up that population immunity to the virus. And there are 4 other coronaviruses that cause the common cold. Well, we know we get those many times every year. So huge problems. It looks great on paper, but there are practical difficulties. Science is split on this issue, and until we have a vaccine, it's likely to remain so.
Thomas Moore reporting there. We've also had the latest government data about the current scale of the coronavirus pandemic in the UK. Department of Health says 14,162 new cases of coronavirus have been reported in the last 24 hours. 70 new deaths have been recorded, and that brings the number of people who have now died from COVID-19 in the UK to 42,515. Now, the Cabinet Office Minister Michael Gove has said to put the blame on him if things were to go wrong at the Kent border at the end of the year. Updating Parliament's EU Committee on the progress of Brexit trade negotiations, Mr Gove also agreed that there was a 66% chance of a deal with Europe.
How confident of it successfully achieving a deal are you? Is it still 66%, or are you now much lower than that?
No, I think that the number might have oscillated upwards or downwards since the last time we spoke, Nigel, but I would say that's about right.
Now, the gymnast Amy Tinkler says her Olympic bronze medal wasn't worth the bullying she endured during her gymnastics career. Star of the Rio Games, she's the latest high-profile gymnast to speak out about a culture of fear and fat-shaming within the sport. Sky's Martha Kellner reports.
This is the explosive talent which made Amy Tinkler one of Britain's greatest ever gymnasts. But behind the flawless routines, exhaustive work and an Olympic bronze medal, Tinkler says she was the victim of fat shaming and bullying.
I would give up that medal to not have gone through what I did, which is really sad. Obviously, getting an Olympic medal is like not a normal thing. Not many people can say they've got an Olympic medal, and the fact that I'd just rather not have that to have gone through what I went through, it's really sad.
Tinkler's the highest profile yet of dozens of gymnasts to speak out about a corrosive culture in British gymnastics. The sports head coach Amanda Reddin has stepped aside because of the bullying claims. Tinkler says Reddin and Colin Still, another senior coach, would regularly embarrass athletes about their weight.
I got food poisoning real bad, and I was in hospital overnight, and I came back into gym into Lilleshall when I was feeling better, and Amanda basically turned around and was like, any excuse not to train. And Colin said, well, at least you'll have lost weight now, try not to put it back on. After I'd literally been sick for 24 hours with food poisoning, I was praised for that.
Colin Still says he doesn't recall or have record of making the comments. Both he and Amanda Reddin say they'll fully support an independent investigation into these abuse allegations at British Gymnastics, which is ongoing. But Tinkler says some are still scared to speak out.
No one in British Gymnastics anyone feels comfortable going to. And in most personal clubs, you don't even feel comfortable going to your personal coaches. So until that changes, and until coaches, national coaches, directors, CEOs become approachable and are willing to learn, willing to change and willing to listen, then nothing's going to happen.
British Gymnastics said in a statement, the incidents recounted by Amy are completely unacceptable in our sport. Investigations are already underway into a number of these claims. With their stars turning against them, the governing body is under increasing pressure to place athlete welfare at the heart of its future. Martha Kellner, Sky News.
This is the News Hour at 6, coming up on the eve of Scotland's huge Euro 2020 playoff. How a positive coronavirus test has seen 3 key players forced to withdraw.
Well, guys and girls, hope you all enjoyed this video. Give it a like, give it a comment, share it with your friends, and I'll be back to do another stream later. Thanks for joining me. See you next one. Peace.